I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. In the aftermath of post-tropical storm Fiona, officials in Atlantic Canada are scrambling to provide support to residents in need. This comes as the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador says residents impacted by Fiona can access financial support. It would be between $1,000 to $10,000 depending on circumstance. The Nova Scotia government is also offering financial aid to residents and businesses affected by the storm. In Prince Edward Island, the government is giving $5 million to charity and nonprofit organizations that are assisting residents. It has also enacted the province's Disaster Financial Assistance Program. Meanwhile, concerns are rising over the total financial toll of what's being called the most costly storm to hit Atlantic Canada and whether it is covered by insurance. Well, joining us now to tell us more about the cost of this catastrophe and what's covered is Mr. Craig Stewart, Vice President of Climate Change and Federal Issues at the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Mr. Stewart, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks, Nina. Good to be here.
So what is the overall cost of this storm for local economies, sir?
The current estimates are that the storm could cost as much as $700 million in terms of losses. It's early days, though. Claims are just starting to roll in. We'll have a much better handle within about a month of what the true number will be.
Now, that's a hefty number, sir. So how much of that is insured damage? What is covered in this case?
So a good portion of it is insured. Commercial policies, so everything from farming operations to fisheries operations typically have wind and flood coverage for them. So those would be covered. There is municipal facilities, some of which are insured, those will be covered. On the residential side, residential home policies typically cover wind. There are overland flooding provisions in many home policies. Storm surge, however, is not covered. So part of this bill will rely on governments picking up some of those damages.
So considering that storm surges are not included in most insurance policies, are insurance companies evolving at all to improve their coverages, considering that storms and floods and wildfires are becoming sort of the norm here in Canada?
Yes, we've been working really closely with the federal government since 2017, since the Eastern Canada floods, to basically come up with a public-private partnership that would see all types of flood covered no matter where you lived and how high risk you are. That would include storm surge. The task force report on that work actually was released by Minister Blair, the Federal Minister of Emergency Preparedness, just a month ago. And we're expecting federal decisions about the results of that task force, a response to it, in the coming months.
All right, sir. Well, on the residential side, how can residents know what kind of insurance protection to consider, depending on which region of Canada they're in, while still considering the cost of all of this?
So they should always be talking to their broker or insurance representative, getting a sense of what risks they face based upon where they live and what the options are that are provided to them. We always advise that they shop around. If they don't get the coverage that they want from one insurer, shop around and try to find it somewhere else. Depending on different companies' risk appetites, some will offer overland flood or even storm surge coverage, but many will not. So really, you need to look around.
All right, Mr. Stewart, for our viewers in Atlantic Canada right now, what kind of insurance protection do those residents have at this moment that they could access immediately?
So wind, anything that was affected by wind, that affected, like if a tree fell on your car or if a tree fell on your house, then that would be covered. It's standard in almost all policies. Overland flood is covered in some policies if you did buy that optional coverage, which means if heavy torrential rain came in, penetrated your basement, that would be covered. So any fire is always covered in insurance policies. It's only the storm surge issue, which is essentially waves coming in, crashing in through the front door, that isn't offered yet, and that's what we're hoping a public-private and national flood insurance program will cover when it's released in the next year or two.
All right, Mr. Stewart, again, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily and talking to us today.
Thanks, Nima.
All right, up next, we have our interview with Cora Morgan from the First Nations Family Advocate Office to discuss the increase of Indigenous children in Canada's child welfare system. Ms. Morgan and other child welfare experts are warning that the end of birth alerts in Canada cannot be the only step that governments take to keep families together. We'll have that and more important conversations from this past week when we return, so stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. The number of newborns taken into care dropped dramatically as birth alerts ended across Canada. However, child welfare experts warn that ceasing the practice alone cannot be the only step that governments take to keep families together. The latest census data from StatsCan indicates Indigenous children continue to be overrepresented in the child welfare system. They make up 53.8% of foster care children in Canada. Advocates point to the children who were taken from their families through the residential school system and the 60s scoop that continue to face mental health issues and trauma. Cora Morgan from the First Nations Family Advocacy Office says that government reforms alone won't get to the root of the issue and that officials need to invest in prevention and healing. Ms. Morgan joins us now. Ms. Morgan, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hi there. Thank you
So,
for having me.
so let's start with how the practice of birth alerts has impacted First Nations communities in Canada in particular.
Well, we've had over 150 years of stolen children from residential school to 60 scoop to, the practice of day schools, now the current child welfare system. And one of the common practices has been the use of birth alerts, meaning alerting that a mother is potentially unfit to parent her child. And so, um, that was the act of issuing these alerts on mothers, and then different entities intervening and perhaps apprehending the baby at birth. And so there's two things: there's the use of birth alerts and unfairly targeting mothers, and then there's also the actual act of taking newborn babies, which is really devastating.
And many experts, including yourself, say ending birth alerts is just the first step to addressing these systemic issues that are facing Indigenous children in childcare. So, what are the other steps that need to be taken?
Well, of course, we need to use birth alerts. We also have to go back to restored jurisdictions of our First Nations, being able to take control of the child welfare systems and implementing, First Nations led approaches to caring for children and families. We need to do a lot of work to address the social issues that have um, become quite challenging and rampant as a result of over 150 years of stolen children. Our elders say the most violent act you can commit to a woman is to steal her child. And so when you think about, the hundreds of thousands of First Nations people who've been affected by having their children taken and those children being displaced, there's a lot of damage that's been done. So there's really a need for, healing and getting to the root cause. And, we have really challenging issues of poverty in this country, and particularly here in Manitoba. We have the biggest riding in all of Canada, and over 60% of the children are living far below the poverty line. So when you have those kind of issues that are happening in our country, those things need serious attention and address, and real commitments to create change and finding alternatives to apprehending. A lot of times when you've taken so many generations of children, you need to be able to invest in bringing back ability to parent. So many people have been taken by systems that when they go and have their own children, they've never been raised in a loving, caring home, and really need to have the opportunity to experience that and know how to do that.
All right, Ms. Morgan, a little over a minute left here, but I want to jump to a recent deal, a $20 billion settlement agreement, the largest in history to compensate Indigenous children impacted by the underfunded child welfare system. So, what are your thoughts on this program? Is it enough to deal with this intergenerational trauma, with the hundreds of years of abuse that Indigenous communities have faced?
Well, of course, I'm never going to agree that it's going to be enough, because there's been a lot of, irreparable damage. The $20 billion deal is a capper on what potential damage could have been done. There's no real true numbers that is attached to and account for. And you have to realize that for many of our First Nations children, if they were born with any kind of extra medical needs, and part of the practice, particularly in our provinces, is that if a community or First Nation didn't have the medical tools or resources or professional people to care, those children were automatically apprehended from their nations and put into the foster care system. And so that $20 billion has to account for all those children who were just apprehended merely because there wasn't enough um, care offered or capacity for medical care in those communities. So it's encompassing a real large number of children, and I don't think there's a real true account of how many children that covers. So, and it's kind of up in the air between the age range of or years that this is happening.
Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists last week has brought the war in Ukraine across the border to Russia. This comes as Russians revolt against the order in an unusual but bold move. In just a matter of days, the decree has triggered outrage, protests, and acts of violence across the country. Demonstrations can be seen from the biggest cities in the country to the most remote regions of Russia. It has also sparked a fearful exodus of men of fighting age from the country. With us now to unpack the situation is Mr. John Hardy, Russian Program Deputy Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Great to be with you.
So, what does Mr. Putin's partial mobilization entail for Russians, and who would be called upon?
Sure. So, in theory, it's only supposed to call up folks with prior military experience, and especially folks with certain specialties that are needed in Ukraine. In practice, we're seeing that a vast many more categories of people are being called up. Folks without military experience, even in some cases, disabled people, things of that nature. It seems that the Ministry of Defense has sort of given quotas to the regions and said, okay, you take it from here. And in response, the regional authorities are sort of scrambling to hit their targets and just vacuuming up as many people as they can in a short period of time.
Now, initially, this order was to call up 300,000 potential troops, but there is a lot of concern around the actual number of men being mobilized in this order and whether they are in fighting condition or not, as you have mentioned. So tell us a little bit more about what you've been hearing in terms of the numbers here.
Right. So, as you just mentioned, the public number was 300K. There's been reports about, a million, 200,000. We'll see. Regardless, Russia, the current Russian army is not the Soviet army. It's designed for mass mobilization. So it's going to take time, some months, to hit, many hundreds of thousands of mobilized troops. So this will happen in phases, regardless of the ultimate number. And I suspect over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, we'll start to get a sense of exactly how far they'll go. And it might be that Moscow decides in 2 months' time, hey, we're going to need another 100, 200K, whatever, and then they'll go from there. I think the big question is, overall, will they stick to the specialized, kind of narrowly targeted mobilization of people with military experience, or will they really go much broader? It's hard to tell just from TikTok videos and whatnot from mobilized Russians, whether these examples of people with no military experience being mobilized are isolated cases, or if this is going to be a significant chunk of the mobilized population.
All right, Mr. Hardy, tell us a little bit more about the situation on the ground in the country. What has been the response so far from Russians?
Well, there's been protests in a number of cities. However, they've been relatively small scale. I think the first day or so there was maybe 1,300 detained protesters, and the Russian authorities are actually giving many of them draft summons, probably as a way to deter a future protest. So I think that the Kremlin seems to be banking on some public opposition, but not really a critical level. So at least right now, they're probably feeling okay about it. I don't think anything we've seen so far is beyond the Russian government's ability to handle.
All right, sir, just about a minute left here. But in other major news, we know the referendum voting on annexation ends today in the Russian occupied regions of Ukraine. But we do know the outcome is widely expected to be predetermined. So, how would this likely impact the ongoing war? Could you see Ukrainians in these potentially annexed regions being forced to fight for Russia?
Well, so in the areas that were already occupied, before the full-scale invasion, there's been a lot of that, and I think actually the Russians have probably forcibly mobilized just about everybody they can there. They're probably just about out of manpower in those areas. Yet maybe they'll try to do the same thing in the others. There's been some reports of that going on, or at least preparations for it. But we'll have to see. In general, I don't think that'd be a great strategy for Russia. These people, for obvious reasons, most of them are not going to be very motivated to fight for the Russians.
All right, Mr. Hardy, lots to keep our eyes on as this war unfolds. Again, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a deeper look at Quebec's upcoming provincial election. We were joined by Dr. Danielle Beland, political science expert and director at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. He highlighted the major issues of the campaign, how the parties are standing in the polls, and what he is watching for ahead of Election Day on October 3rd. So stay with us. Forum Daily's Week in Review. We'll be right back after a short break. Coalition Avenir Quebec leader François Legault says Quebecers are not interested in electoral reform. Now, that's even though his party is projected to win roughly 100 seats in the 125-seat legislature in Monday's election. This even though it's polling at less than 40% support. But Mr. Legault says he is open to working with opposition parties on issues such as the environment and the protection of French. But at a campaign stop in Montreal yesterday, Liberal leader Dominique Anglade said she didn't believe Mr. Legault's show of good faith. Well, with us now to discuss the state of the Quebec election is Dr. Danielle Beland, professor at McGill University and director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for your invitation.
Now, as we mentioned, the CAQ has been projected to win a majority. So do you think this election has largely been a battle for second place?
Yes, we are talking a lot about who might form the official opposition in the province. It could be the Liberals again, but the Liberals have lost ground in the polls, even since the last provincial election. We have also Québec Solidaire, which is the left-wing party, which is strong, especially among younger voters and in big cities. And there is also the Parti québécois, which is doing better in the polls than at the beginning of the campaign. And finally, the Conservative Party of Quebec, which used to be quite marginal in Quebec politics, but is now doing quite well. So all these four opposition parties are neck and neck in the polls in terms of popular votes, but we expect the Liberals probably to have more seats because the support is more concentrated in specific geographical areas like on the West Island of Montreal.
Now, as we mentioned, Mr. Legault said he is open to working with opposition parties when it comes to environmental issues and French language protection. But what have been some of the other major issues of the campaign trail?
Well, we have talked a lot about immigration, including controversial comments on the part of the premier and one of his ministers recently. So immigration has been top of mind, I think, in terms of the discussions, really. The environment is a major issue, and the CAQ has been criticized for not doing enough to address climate change. So healthcare is always a big topic in provincial politics, and our healthcare system suffers from quite a few challenges right now. Long-term care is also an issue. So yes, plenty of topics, plenty of issues to talk about during this campaign.
And amid all these issues, what has the overall mood of the election been among voters in Quebec following the pandemic? And of course, now we have the issue of inflation.
Well, I think inflation is a major concern for most people. Participation in advance voting was quite high on Sunday and Monday. So we hope that participation will be high as well on Monday, on election day. But I think, yes, economic issues are very important to voters, and inflation is I would say, a priority for all the parties to explain what they will do if they form government to address this pain, really, that many people feel at the pump and feel when they go to the supermarket and so forth. Also, housing is an issue that in Quebec used to be, including Montreal, quite affordable in terms of housing, but things have changed quite rapidly, and this has become an issue related to inflation.
All right, Mr. Belanda. Now, just about a minute left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as the campaign trail proceeds up until the election this upcoming Monday?
Well, I think I will look at especially what's happening in the different ridings where the leaders of these parties are really fighting for their political life. Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, the leader of the PQ, Dominique Anglade, the leader of the Liberal Party of Quebec, and Éric Duhaime, the leader of the Conservative Party of Quebec, are not certain at all to actually win a seat in the National Assembly. So we'll see whether they can actually make a case for that and win a seat on Monday night.
Lots to keep our eyes on in this upcoming election. Sir, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
You're most welcome. Take care.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. For more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok for updates. You can also watch all of our programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us again on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada.